a real pleasure to be with you. And when I first heard the name of this gentleman who just introduced me, I heard it as straight Macbeth. It kind of sounds like Macbeth. When I was a senior in high school, our English teacher had us study Macbeth by Shakespeare. And she did it by, in each act, assigning different people different roles. Then we read from our desks. And at one of these, she assigned me to play Macbeth, to read Macbeth's lines. And I had a great rival at my tiny high school, and we fought for who made the best grades, et cetera, all throughout high school. And she assigned my rival to play the part in this act of the page, who comes in and announces to Macbeth that Birnam Wood is indeed marching upon Dunsinane. And then is Macbeth's line. And I saw what it was and saw what a favor my teacher had done me, and I pointed to my rival who had just read the line from the page and gave Shakespeare's line, which was to the page, "The devil damn thee black, thou cream-faced loon." Well, it is a pleasure for me to be again in Canada. I'm not up here often, but we've trained a lot of people who have come to our trainings in the United States, and on occasion we hold training programs here in Canada. I actually have a family link to Canada. My mother's father was the son and grandson of Cambridge graduates who were Church of England ministers. But my grandfather decided not to follow the family tradition and announced to his family that he wanted to be a medical doctor. This was about 1882. His mother was outraged, and she replied, "A doctor, that's just one step above being a barber. You need to be in some respectable profession like the law or the church." They had a row. My grandfather persisted in his intention. They would not help him. He became a British merchant seaman for some years, and then he became, for 6 or 7 years, a bachelor farmer of winter wheat in Manitoba. After he had saved up enough money, and I guess there weren't that many opportunities to spend your money out in Manitoba in those days, he moved to the U.S. and put himself through the University of Cincinnati Medical School and got his MD after age 40. But that's my Canada heritage. Well, there's a lot that could be said in enormous detail about the topic that I'm going to address, and I don't think it would be practical to try to go into detailed lectures about the fine points of political training. The engine of conservative politics in America is the conservative movement, which began largely as a serious intellectual movement in the 1950s. Its principles were already limited government, free enterprise, strong national defense, and traditional values. But it focused primarily on developing its ideas and on the important job of attracting others to those ideas. Typically, conservative intellectuals considered the nitty-gritty of political action beneath their dignity. They identified the errors and dangers of the left. They persuasively promoted an inspiring set of conservative ideas, and they did grow a movement. They formed some national conservative organizations, which modestly prospered without raising much money or identifying, much less activating, really large numbers of people. When they did try political action, these early movement conservatives chose to work almost entirely within the Republican Party. But that party was then dominated by Eastern establishment Republicans like Nelson Rockefeller, who seemed to have all the money, and as far as internal Republican matters were concerned, the support of all the major print and broadcast media. The nascent conservative intellectual movement managed to attract and recruit sufficient numbers of experienced but earnest grassroots conservative, inexperienced but earnest grassroots conservative activists like me to nominate Barry Goldwater for president in 1964, where I was Goldwater's youngest elected delegate. But Lyndon Johnson's landslide victory that year produced confident and loud predictions that conservatism in politics in the United States was dead for good. But history didn't work out that way. Starting in 1965, a number of Goldwater supporters, including me, gravitated to the center of politics, the D.C. area. Hardly any of us had known each other earlier, much less had prominent roles in the Goldwater campaign, but our past personal support of Goldwater credentialed us to each other as we eventually met, sometimes by working together in election contests, legislative battles, or Republican organizations, but often we would meet only by chance. And that process of mutual acquaintance took several years. I was executive director of the National College Republicans 5.5 years in the late 60s and 1970. And I met there one Lee Edwards. He had served high up in the Goldwater campaign as director of information. And then he came to Washington, D.C. and opened a conservative public relations firm. His was the area's only conservative public relations firm. The New York Times later called Lee Edwards the voice of the silent majority. Lee generously mentored me, and I supplied college Republican volunteers for the conservative events that he organized. In early May 1972, while I worked at the American Enterprise Institute, a free market think tank, Lee Edwards introduced me to his friend Richard Viguerie. Viguerie had served as executive director of Young Americans for Freedom, the youth group organized around the groundswell for Barry Goldwater. Viguerie had moved to the D.C. area in 1965 to form what turned out to be a spectacularly successful direct mail consulting firm. For most conservatives, Viguerie was famous, but a man of mystery. 7 years living together in the same town, I had never met him. He worked very long hours building his business, and he did not circulate socially in what was then the very small circle of D.C. area conservatives. The story spread that Richard Viguerie had behind his desk a giant faucet which he could turn on, and money would pour into the coffers of any organization he decided to allow to become his clients. A couple of weeks after our first meeting, Richard offered me a job with his company. Morton, he said, I want you to come help me build the conservative movement. I accepted enthusiastically because building the conservative movement was exactly what I wanted to do. And the story of Richard Viguerie's movement building in the 1970s has been told many times. No longer almost a recluse, he sought out philosophically sound conservatives who had proved themselves as activists in various areas of the public policy process. Most of them already knew and trusted each other, and he invited them often and hosted them at mostly small but innumerable meetings and meals to discuss, to figure out, and to implement what had to be done for conservatives to start beating the liberals in politics. I served for 7 years as his political assistant and also as a direct mail account executive. I helped organize Richard's movement building meetings, and I participated actively in them. The discussions often proved highly productive. Leaders of some previously existing good conservative groups did not agree with some of the conclusions reached in the Viguerie meetings, particularly the decisions to encourage the creation of a wide variety of new conservative organizations and to persuade existing conservative groups to develop the skills required to grow dramatically in membership and political effectiveness. Some leaders of pre-existing groups felt creating new organizations would only drain resources from existing organizations. Our response was that if conservatives couldn't increase our resources and members, we would never win. Jump-starting the conservative movement worked, and before long, new conservative groups of all types sprang up, doing good work in many conservative issue areas, first dozens, then hundreds, and now literally thousands of new groups. As a guide for conservatives wanting to start new public policy organizations or expand existing ones, many years ago I wrote a booklet entitled The Conservative Organizational Entrepreneur. I periodically updated it. That booklet is now easily accessible for free online. Again, the name is The Conservative Organizational Entrepreneur, and I think there are a couple of the printed booklets here. A number of long-established organizations grew spectacularly in the 1970s. For example, the well-respected National Right to Work Committee increased from 25,000 members in 1972 to more than 1.7 million members in 1979. What had been largely a conservative intellectual movement grew into a formidable, workable coalition of better skilled, self-identified conservative activists and leaders able to defeat the left in many political contests, that is, elections and legislative battles, and thereby to affect public policy. During those years of vigorous meetings, I summarized what participants had discovered. I described what made the big difference which enabled the exciting and effective growth of conservative activity, the creation of what the news media began by the middle 1970s to describe as the new right. I called my summary The Real Nature of Politics, and I have taught it to conservative activists and leaders ever since. And I have condensed it, and here it is. Being right in the sense of being correct is not sufficient to win. The winner in a political contest is determined over time by the number and effectiveness of the activists on the respective sides. The number and effectiveness of the activists on a given side is determined by its use of political technology, which includes organizational technology and communications technology. Most political technology is philosophically neutral, which makes it inherently unattractive to people who are motivated by their philosophy. Nevertheless, you owe it to your philosophy to study how to win. You have a moral obligation to study how to win. To the extent possible, movement-oriented conservatives should develop activists and leaders who are philosophically sound, technologically proficient, and movement-oriented. It is certainly a lot easier to teach someone already solidly conservative the skills necessary to win than it is to make a committed conservative out of someone who is already a skilled opportunist. But committed conservatives often resist the study of philosophically neutral techniques. Many of them think disdainfully, that's mere technology. I'm focused on the really important things. Young, unskilled conservatives who are nevertheless intellectuals read ardently, and they are greatly affected by what they read. Often their reading gives them an incomplete understanding of political reality. But often they can learn the real nature of politics through exposure to some writings of famed conservative intellectuals whom they already deeply admire. As a conservative activist since 1960, I have read or heard reverently repeated innumerable times a short sentence, which I'm certain has circulated in this country. Ideas have consequences. That's the title of a book by Professor Richard Weaver. Conservative intellectuals and would-be intellectuals are so enamored of the words, ideas have consequences, that probably each day someone at the Heritage Foundation in D.C. receives correspondence in which these words are written. But if ideas in and of themselves really do have consequences, then being right in the sense of being correct is sufficient. If you know you are right, particularly if you believe you can prove you are right, then your ideas inevitably will prevail. For a young person with intellectual aspirations, this is heady stuff. He concludes he need no longer work with mere mortals in their ordinary plane of existence. He feels elevated above them. He knows that they will eventually conform to his ideas. Thousands of young conservatives caught up in the delight of thinking deep thoughts find that the world does not treat them as they expect and as they believe they deserve. Public policy battles, for example, do not often turn on the question of who is provably right. Confronted with the failure of their ideas to have the merited consequences, many a young conservative becomes embittered. Some, in the words of my friend, the late Professor Warren Nutter at the University of Virginia, retreat to the citadel to save the books. Others become opportunists and quiet cynics. With great inner agony, some resign themselves to impotence in a world that does not function as they think it should, and too few discover how to make their ideas effective. For a number of reasons, it would not be fair to blame Richard Weaver for the problems associated with his magically titled book. He was a professor of rhetoric, which can be defined as ideas artfully presented. A master rhetorician, Weaver knew full well that ideas do not necessarily have consequences. Although it is dangerous to suggest how deceased people would respond to current questions, I am confident Weaver would affirm that his book title, Ideas Have Consequences, is a rhetorically contracted enthymeme, an enthymeme being a syllogism with one or more of the elements missing but understood. Expanding Weaver's enthymeme, we can get the following syllogism. Ideas can motivate people to act. Actions have consequences. Therefore, ideas can have consequences. Without understanding Weaver's true meaning, some conservatives often give his three words a dangerously misplaced, almost religious devotion. A noble confidence in the truth of their ideas can lure them into the voluntary paralysis of a life of contemplation. For anyone who makes the effort to read the difficult but highly rewarding Richard Weaver, his meaning is brilliantly clear. In the book, he actually wrote, quote, "The youth is an intellectual, only a believer in ideas, who thinks that ideas can overwhelm the world. The mature man passes beyond intellectuality to wisdom." That doesn't sound like a man who believes that ideas are efficacious without something more. Elsewhere in Ideas Have Consequences, he wrote, "Organization always makes imperative counter-organization. A force in being is a threat to the unorganized, who must answer by becoming organized themselves." I believe that more than any other thinker, 18th century British statesman Edmund Burke laid the intellectual foundations of modern conservatism. And of course, he also provided and brilliantly communicated the arguments which activated Britain and much of Europe against the horrors inherent in the French Revolution. We cannot help but admire Burke's towering intellectual achievements for liberty and order. Burke was a practicing professional politician virtually all his adult life. In him, we see a principled man who, during all his long career, took vigorous actions to promote his principles. A man who understood the proper relationship between ideas and actions. A man who stood by good causes even when it appeared those causes were losing. In 1770, Burke wrote, "It is the business of the speculative philosopher to mark the proper ends of government. It is the business of the politician, who is the philosopher in action, to find out proper means to those ends and to employ them with effect." Burke could not take seriously people who failed to act and act skillfully on their principles. He wrote, "For my part, I find it impossible to conceive that anyone who believes in his own politics or thinks them to be of any weight, who refuses to adopt the means by having them reduced into practice. In other words, you owe it to your philosophy, first, to study how to win, and second, to take appropriate actions to win if you can." Burke explicitly held that education as to issues and philosophy was insufficient. He argued, what is right should not only be made known, but made prevalent. That which is evil should not only be detected, but defeated. When the public man omits to put himself in a situation of doing his duty with effect, it is an omission that frustrates the purposes of his trust almost as much as if he had formally betrayed it. It is surely no very rational account of a man's life that he has always acted right, but has taken special care to act in such a manner that his endeavors could not possibly be productive of any consequence. Now, however, we should know better. Edmund Burke did not tell us all that is necessary to triumph over evil is for men to have enough good ideas. Quite the contrary. The most famous words attributed to Burke are, "All that is necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing." The reason for the increasing success of conservative ideas recently in my country, and to some extent I can document in other countries, is not that our ideals are much more correct now than those we held, say, in the Goldwater era. We prosper in many ways because we have begun to study the political process. Through recruitment and training to increase the number and effectiveness of our activists and leaders, and to work together to implement our new knowledge. We must teach young intellectuals that a flattering and seductive talisman that they do not fully understand will not guarantee them success. They must not rely on victory falling into their deserving hands like ripe fruit off of a tree. They have to earn it. Good ideas have desirable consequences only if we act intelligently for them. My Leadership Institute was the first educational foundation in the United States to do other than educate people about issues in philosophy. That's what all the others did. Many of them did marvelous work. I decided to create a foundation to recruit people who are reasonably conservative without putting too narrow a definition on it, and then teach them how to succeed in government, politics, and the news media. In 2015, more than 10,200 people took my training courses in person. We offer now 44 different types of training programs about a great number of areas of expertise in the public policy process. In addition to those 10,200, we offer much more frequently now Leadership Institute courses online. Powerful training programs are hard to accomplish. You have to have clearly in mind the purpose of the training program. You have to decide which topics to present. You have to come to an understanding of what should be the content of each presentation. You have to decide what materials to be presented with each presentation and distribute them to participants. You have to choose really competent faculty, and you have to figure out how to best recruit people for the particular type of training that you're going to present. My Leadership Institute programs catalog is also available online, but I have, along with other materials, a stack here about this high of the program catalogs which describe the more than 40 training programs that we offer. Campaign Management School, Future Candidate School, Youth Leadership Schools, Fundraising Schools, Public Relations Schools, Effective Television Technique Schools, many different types of schools. I am pleased to report to you that the success of the Leadership Institute in recent years has convinced at least a dozen other national conservative and libertarian organizations in the United States to begin to offer useful training programs for successful political participation. I commend their efforts. I very often have been of considerable success in helping them at their request to be of assistance in putting together their programs. Now, I do not entirely neglect to provide philosophical education to my students. Thousands of Leadership Institute graduates each year receive copies of a booklet I wrote which is entitled Read to Lead. That's the green booklet there. It also is available for free online, and it lists and briefly discusses 26 books I believe to be especially valuable as a foundation for movement conservatives. And each year I give away to bright students hundreds of copies of books by F.A. Hayek, Milton Friedman, Edmund Burke, Frederick Bastiat, Thomas Sowell, Russell Kirk, Paul Johnson, Whittaker Chambers, and others of like mind. But traditionally conservative educational efforts focused exclusively on teaching about issues in philosophy, and that is not, in the main, what I do. By the 1970s, the left had begun using government in wide-ranging attacks on what are now called social issues. Until then, those issues had long been considered as settled in America and outside of the public policy process. As a result of liberal attacks through the public policy process, millions of social conservatives who had previously been inactive in politics became political participants to defend themselves, and that turned out to be much to the benefit and the political success of the Republican Party. There have been for a long time, and still are, in the Republican Party, some calls for a truce on social issues. It's not new. Starting in the 1970s, some widely publicized nominal Republicans who claimed to be fiscal conservatives began to urge loudly that conservatives committed to traditional moral values should stop supporting their principles through political advocacy and participation. But the liberals, of course, have no intention of stopping their use of government power systematically against traditional values. Content-free Republicans today know that full well, but they act as if they expect millions of traditional values conservatives to support Republican candidates who are silent about or even left-wing on social issues. Fat chance. In different ways, I have taken an active part in 5 large waves of newly active conservatives and libertarians entering politics through the Republican Party. The first wave, I became politically active during the conservative awakening around Barry Goldwater, as I mentioned to you, in the late 1950s and early 1960s. The second wave, in the 1970s, helping Richard Viguerie and others achieve our declared intention to build politically effective conservative movement. And I personally helped create and assisted useful conservative groups of many types, and we built that, and it was soon called the New Right. The third wave. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, I worked with conservative religious leaders who recruited millions of theologically conservative Americans into politics for the first time. I served on the Reagan White House staff for 3 years and was his liaison to all conservative groups and all religious groups. Those religious groups were included in what was then began to be called the, quote, religious right. The fourth wave. When the Tea Party movement arose in 2009, the Leadership Institute began immediately to arrange co-sponsored political grassroots training schools with every one of the several national Tea Party groups, even though these groups were rivals and in some cases hate each other and were filing suits against each other. We also co-sponsored many training programs with state and local Tea Party organizations, and we've trained thousands of them, and that training program continues. The fifth wave, and counting, the Liberty Movement, generated largely around the Ron Paul presidential campaign and then the Rand Paul campaign, has sent thousands of their supporters, largely young people, to my training schools. Most newly active libertarians understand that to advance their principles most effectively, they must work in cooperation with others and within the Republican Party. Now, there's a pattern to these 5 waves. In each case, the left and the mainstream media, which is not much different in my country, charged that the newly active conservatives and libertarians were ignorant extremists who could not possibly succeed in politics, were incompatible with Republicans and previously active conservatives, and even were racists. There were almost exactly the same attacks from the left and from content-free Republicans every time for more than 50 years now. And each time the charges were wrong, wrong, wrong. New waves of active conservatives nominated Goldwater, nominated and elected Reagan, and were undoubtedly decisive in the 2010 and 2014 national elections and in victories of many other conservative Republican candidates over the last 50 years. Moreover, the new activists don't all drop out of politics. Many, like me from the Goldwater era, are still active. Social issue conservatives who changed the direction of America in 1980 still work effectively in the public policy process. Waves of new participants continue this process. For example, in Virginia in 2012, longtime movement conservatives worked closely with Tea Party activists and Ron Paul supporters to overturn a Republican establishment control of our state party committee in my home state. Similarly, united coalitions recently won important internal Republican state party elections in many states, including states as diverse as Maryland, Delaware, Iowa, Missouri, Michigan, and even Massachusetts. The process is cumulative. Huge numbers of new activists who get their first taste of politics in grassroots activity in one election cycle keep fighting for their principles for decades to come. Always, some of them become a new generation of conservative leaders in elections for public office, legislative battles, and intra-party contests. Wise conservatives know that the way to win in politics is to increase the number and effectiveness of principled conservative activists and leaders who are philosophically sound, technologically proficient, and movement-oriented. Conservatives with no practical political experience at all can participate, at least at the entry level, in any political party of their choice. Certainly that's true in the Republican Party, and they have many opportunities over time to become effective for their principles and even to become party leaders. There are 168 members of the Republican National Committee. I'm one of 3 from Virginia, and I'm number 4 in tenure of the 168 members. Here's a course of action which many conservatives could take successfully. Volunteer to work in the election campaigns of your party's nominees. Underpromise and overperform. Donate to your party's good candidates. Financial contributions put you on the political map. Attend party fundraising events. Give to your local, provincial, national parties. Then attend party committee meetings. There you will get to know the existing party activists and leaders, and they will get to know you. If your local party committee has a vacancy, accept it if offered, but modestly keep your eyes and ears open and your mouth shut as you learn the ropes. Most such meetings are not very exciting. So I suggest you always take with you to a party meeting something to read or something to write during the less interesting part of party meetings. If you are not familiar with the organizational structure and rules of your party, get copies of the party rules at every level. Study those rules and the applicable rules of procedure, which I understand in Canada as in the US is generally Robert's Rules of Order, newly revised. At every level, party rules determine how difficult or easy it is for party power to flow from the bottom up. Those who currently hold power in party committees often much prefer for power to flow from the top down. So those who welcome full participation of grassroots conservatives must frequently engage in battles over party rules. Participate in some party auxiliary activities, youth groups, women groups, etc. And if there is none in your area, volunteer to start one. In most areas, there is a fairly rapid turnover of party officers. Don't push yourself for party office. If you do good work in the local party, others probably will ask you to take on some responsibilities. Accept those tasks. Perform them well. Soon you may be drafted into local party committee office. But you don't have to hold a party office to play a leading role from time to time in a party committee. In some areas, local party committees are moribund or dead. The party officers may be unsatisfactory for a variety of reasons. They may be lazy, they may be incompetent, they may be fine people burned out from years of good work, they may be hanging on to power for its own sake, they may be actively hostile to your conservative principles. If party leaders are unsatisfactory, I suggest you work to see that they are reformed or replaced. Build strong working ties with other conservatives you meet in party activities. Build strong working ties with the leaders of conservative non-party activity in your community, such as taxpayer associations, veterans groups, ethnic organizations, right-to-work groups, right-to-keep and bear arms groups, civic associations, church groups, traditional values groups concerned about issues such as abortion, traditional marriage, education, or government infringement on religious liberty to practice and promote your faith. Make contacts with national conservative groups to locate and involve their local activists in your party. Learn the principles of effective direct marketing and start to assemble lists of contact information for local conservative activists and donors. Party committees often have influence in the election of candidates for public office, but in some cases they have decisive power over the rules and therefore the outcomes of nominations contests. Find out the role of your party committees in the nomination process and the schedule of their required activities before upcoming elections. Party activities must renew themselves periodically, usually in 2-year or 4-year cycles. New party committees may be elected by primaries, conventions, mass meetings, or other methods. Newly elected committees usually elect new party officers. Local party units usually send delegates to party conventions at higher levels. Sometimes membership on party committees and delegate slots to party conventions are available just by properly filling in the papers for those openings. Find out how those processes work, and among other things you'll need to know: when are the next party primaries or conventions, what party offices are to be filled, and for what public offices or party nominees to be chosen, what are the deadlines for filing, dates of conventions, dates of nominations, and how does one file? How are the dates set? Are they set by law or party decision? What are the requirements for party committee membership? What's the requirements for eligibility to be a convention delegate? If your party has an executive committee, who serves on it? How are its members chosen? Because all local party committees and party primaries, certainly in my country and I believe here, are open at the bottom, whoever gets the most people to participate wins. To succeed, you must organize a sufficient number of conservatives to win nominations, conventions, party committee elections. It is simple, but it is not easy. Much more information about what I have to say about this topic, about how to participate effectively in the party of your choice, can be found in a piece that I wrote in 1993. It is called The Life of the Party. The way to grow a party is to treat newcomers fairly, politely, and even cordially, and to show them that power in the party frequently flows from the bottom up rather than only from the top down. The late Frank Meyer, for many years a senior editor of National Review magazine, persuaded movement-oriented conservatives like me in the 1960s, the early 1960s, that there is a natural alliance between people who love liberty and those who deeply believe in traditional values. Meyer argued that, at root, the two interests are philosophically compatible and that they ought to be and are compatible for practical political purposes. Frank Meyer's analysis of this matter can be found in his writings in National Review and his book, In Defense of Freedom, which is one of the 26 books I recommend in my booklet, Read to Lead. Nevertheless, the left and content-free Republicans cling to their fond hope that their conservative opponents can't possibly work together. We'll see. Centrifugal forces try to pull apart the elements of any coalition. Different elements of the coalition have different priorities, and very rarely some of those priorities are in conflict. However, there are centripetal forces which pull people together in politics. When the same organizations and the same leaders work side by side against the same enemies in a long series of election contests and legislative battles, they tend to become comfortable together. They frequently confer, make plans around the same tables, and get to know each other on a first-name basis. They fight against the same enemy, the left, and they know that the left would destroy all of them without a single scruple. They learn which of their allies are trustworthy and come to like them. And before long, the leader of one group goes to dinner at the home of the leader of another group, and when he arrives at the front door, the dog there wags its tail rather than barks. Through such processes, movements and normal governing majorities are born. Unity is easier in an embattled minority where survival is at risk. Centrifugal forces grow in strength after a principled minority defeats its opposition. Foolish elements of the new majority, heady with success, may take actions grossly offensive to other groups in their coalition. Okay, I've got 2 more paragraphs, short ones. Leftists and content-free activists will not be persuaded by sweet reason to change their ways, nor will many of them change for fear of future defeats by conservatives and libertarians. Some content-free elected officials and party leaders will have to be replaced before some parties can be reliable for conservative principles. Only a critical mass of principled conservatives and libertarians can preserve and advance their principles, and only if they work together and do not compromise in ways which accepts the left's power grabs as permanent. Conservative principles may be defeated in some elections and legislative battles, but they can triumph in the long run if those principles are faithfully upheld as the alternative to the left's agenda. Thank you very much.